All right, Adam, do you think we should go ahead and get started?
Yeah, just go ahead and get started.
Awesome. So welcome everyone. Today we're really excited to welcome you to today's talk from Dr. Shari Liu, whose talk is in support of academics for Black wellness and survival. I'll share the link to this fund in the chat. And now I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Carly, to further introduce today's series.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Liana. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the next talk in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience speaker series. Before beginning, we want to acknowledge the indigenous lands from which we are joining today's talk. I am joining you today from Washington, District of Columbia, land taken from two indigenous peoples, the Nahachitanga, or also known as the Anacostions, as well as the Piscataway peoples. Please use the link that I've just sent to the chat to research and reflect on the indigenous lands from which you are joining us today. And through the acknowledgement of past harms, we can then move towards a more equitable and humane future. On behalf of all of the students and postdocs on the organizing committee, I'm very excited to welcome you to today's Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience seminar. The organizing committee together represents a consortium of colleges and universities, including Dartmouth, UPenn, Yale, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and Gallaudet. We are committed to highlighting advances in cognitive neuroscience research. And we acknowledge that the privilege of these institutions. We also wish to make the science discussed here available and accessible far beyond the ivory tower of academia. With the consent of our speakers, we plan to make these talks publicly available. We'll do so on our website, as well as make the seminars open to anyone interested. And last but not least, a quick note to those of you who are new to this series. After this talk is over, we'll move over to a new Zoom room for the Q&A. This is a space for anyone to ask additional questions that weren't answered during the talk, and/or questions about Dr. Liu's career and her work as a scientist. I'll post the link in the chat now and once more after the presentation has concluded. Which now brings me to our guests. Now I'll turn it over to Erica, who will introduce Dr. Liu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carly. So today I'm excited to introduce you all to Dr. Shari Liu. Dr. Liu received her undergraduate degree in psychology and education from Dartmouth College in 2014. She then obtained her PhD from Harvard University in 2020, working with Elizabeth Spelke, and is currently an NIH F32 postdoctoral fellow at MIT working with Rebecca Sachs. Her research investigates the origins of intelligence in the minds and brains of infants and children, and starting in 2023, she will start her own lab as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Liu's website shows an impressive dedication to both mentorship and teaching, and I'm sure her trainees and students at Johns Hopkins will benefit significantly from this. Some of her many accolades include the Goethals Teaching Prize and Bach Center Certificate of Distinction in Teaching from Harvard University, as well as the Glushko Dissertation Prize from the Cognitive Science Society. Her talk today is entitled Modeling People as Minds Acting in a Physical World. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shari Liu.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers and the interpreters. I wanted also to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Cambridge/Somerville, Massachusetts, which is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people. And I wanted to highlight this organization, Academics for Black Survival and Wellness, which is dedicated to healing for Black folks and accountability for non-Black folks in academia. They have excellent programming every year, and I encourage you to check it out. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Modeling People as Minds Acting in a Physical World. And this title is also a hypothesis about what we do when we look at a scene like this. So let's have a look. So what's here? We have a scene with a person and some objects, but we understand a lot more. We see this person as an agent with a physical body and a mind, with a particular perspective, visual perspective of the physical world, where the potential goals are objects, the constraints are physical, and the agent has a goal in mind and can act to make that goal real. So the big picture hypothesis of my research program is that from infancy, we use intuitive theories of psychology that's grounded in physical understanding to understand other people's minds and actions. So when I started grad school, there was a whole body of work showing that infants appreciate something about agents. So for example, they're solid, they have goals, they act efficiently, but it was less clear what form that knowledge took. So is infants' knowledge just a list of features like this? Or do these findings testify to a form of knowledge that's abstract, coherent, and theory-like? At the time, there were also nice computational accounts of what it would mean to have abstract, coherent, theory-like knowledge. And at the heart of these computational models is that they posit hidden causes for the observations that we see. So for example, the cost and reward that is motivating other agents, and a way of working backwards from what we see to inferring what caused that thing. So from seeing someone's action to inferring what that person's goal was and predicting what's going to happen next. And importantly, this model also has an intuitive theory of physics that connects the world states to the agent's actions in their mind. So this was all in place pretty much by the time that I started graduate school. And today I'm going to tell you about the work that builds on this just very fantastic and foundational work. So today I'm going to talk about three things. So first is my graduate work testing the hypothesis that infants use models of the psychological world that are grounded physically to understand other people's minds and actions. And then I'll talk about two challenges if I actually want to test this hypothesis fully and what I've been working on in my postdoc to achieve them. But first, we're just going to talk about past behavioral work. So first, I'll talk about evidence that infants are sensitive to action around physical constraints, and they use physically grounded information to reason about other people's minds. And throughout the talk, I'm claiming that infants apply a task analysis to a scene like this that is really about minds acting in a physical world. That is, physical constraints impose a cost, a state of the world delivers a reward, and the path is the action that gets you there. So first, what is the evidence that infants see other people's actions as physically grounded? So many studies have tested this. So typically what happens in these experiments is that infants see many trials that involve movies of people or characters moving or over an obstacle towards a goal. And as you can imagine, if babies look at this over and over again, their looking time decreases trial by trial. Then the barrier goes away and infants see the following two test events. One in which the agent follows the same path that's newly inefficient, and the other in which the agent follows a different path, but it's efficient. And the finding from this literature is that if infants see the agent jump, even though it doesn't have to anymore, they'll look longer at that action, even though it follows the very same path they've observed, than an entirely new action that's efficient. And there are control conditions in this literature that's ruling out obvious alternative explanations. So we wanted to know, are infants sensitive to the particular physical constraints that an agent faces? So not just that they're noticing when an agent is jumping when it doesn't need to, but that it's failing to minimize cost in a particular physical situation. So we ran a very similar experiment, testing an ability to detect a subtler way of being inefficient. So these are the stimuli that we showed babies. So as you can see, it's very similar to the experiment that I already covered, except that test, babies see a new low barrier they've never seen before, and 2 jumps, one that's less efficient than the other. And the key prediction is if infants represent relative costs, then look higher at the high jump over the new physical constraint. So I'll show you a box plot of the results where looking time in seconds is on the y-axis. And each line across these boxes is data from a single participant. And I've got the mean and the within subjects 95% confidence intervals in red. I also have beta coefficients above the box plots that express the effect size in standard deviation units. So what do we see? In experiment 1, we found that babies noticed when the agent was inefficient by failing to conform the height of the jump to the height of the barrier, and they looked longer at that action. And in a second experiment, we tested whether they were really reasoning about the physical constraint on the action or just the path. And to do this, we moved the barrier out of the way throughout the entire experiment. And we found that the effect also goes away when we do that, suggesting that the physical constraint being relevant for the agent's action is important to drive this effect. So that was the first thing I worked on in my PhD. In the context of this talk, I think the main takeaway is that infants are sensitive not just to the presence or the absence of an obstacle, but to the particular physical constraints that someone faces when interpreting their actions. So that was evidence that babies use physical constraints to reason about other people's actions. And next, I'll show you that babies also use physical information to reason about other people's minds. So the key question in this next experiment is, do babies share the intuition that we all have, which is that if someone tried hard to get something, they must like it a lot. So in part 1 of the study, babies see this red guy in the middle do costlier actions for one goal than the other. So this is what that looks like. So what you just saw is the agent refused one barrier and accepted one barrier for each of the target goals, but they ended up accepting a taller barrier for one of them. And then we tested whether infants can learn the agent's preference given just information about cost. So we tested this by asking, okay, so now the agent can choose one of them, which one would he choose? And we showed babies both outcomes, and that looked like this. So the argument is that infants need to reason about cost and reward together to succeed here, where reward is something held in that agent's mind and cost is grounded in that agent's body and computed with respect to the physical environment. So here are the findings. We found that infants look longer at the lower value action, that is when the agent was willing to jump a higher barrier for one goal than the other and then chose against that goal at test. So one question we had was, is this really about physical cost per se? It could be about lots of other things. So we ran 2 other experiments that are following exactly the same logic. In experiment 2, cost is the angle of an inclined plane that the agent climbs or refuses to climb. And in experiment 3, cost is the width of a gap that the agent jumps or refuses to jump. And across the 3 experiments, what we're trying to do is controlling for things like vertical motion, horizontal motion, time, speed, path length, such that none of these features uniquely predicted the cost of actions across all the experiments. And we found that in these 3 cases, infants on average look longer when someone does a high cost action for a goal and then decides against choosing that goal later. And one implication of this finding is that really there is something about physics, intuitive physics, that is helping infants succeed. More formally, what does it mean to have an intuitive theory of action? that's grounded in physics. I'm going to just briefly cover the high-level overview of the model, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. So first, there needs to be a sense of rational planning, a process that assigns cost and reward to actions and states and a way of choosing between them. And by assuming that agents choose their actions this way, an observer can observe a set of actions and, knowing which actions are harder than others, work out what are the most likely reward functions that motivated those actions, and then use those inferred reward functions to predict what's going to happen next. So using these principles, we built a set of probabilistic generative models, and we showed that if you're going to model infants' knowledge this way, it's not the only way you can do this, but if you're going to do it this way, we need rich integrated representations of cost reward to do that. Heuristics won't do. So in brief, in panel A is the empirical data from the 3 experiments I presented and other past work. Panels B through F are predictions of different computational models. And I don't have too much time to go into it, except to say, in this space of models, the best model that accounted for these results is a model that has integrated representations of cost and reward that aren't just reducible to heuristics. So this work has 2 main findings that are relevant for the talk today. First, infants reason about other people's actions with respect to specific physical constraints, and they use information about someone's body and the physical situation to reason about information that's in their minds. So I also presented a set of computational models that formalize what it means to have an intuitive theory of psychology that's grounded in physics. And I can't resist showing just one more piece of evidence of this from more recent work. So the main idea that is behind this work is that physical surroundings don't just impose cost on our actions, but also potential risks and dangers. So there are 2 main findings from this work. The first is that infants treat the height that someone could fall from as a kind of cost in parallel with the logic of the previous studies I presented. And also that for kids and adults who can give us quantitative responses in a way that infants can't, they have precise ways of integrating danger into their predictions and explanations. So this is work led by one of my awesome thesis students. And the implication of this work is that we use not only actual physical states to reason about action and minds, but also potentially hypothetical physical states that may or may not become real. Okay, that was part 1. So starting in infancy, I said we use physical information to reason about other people's actions and minds. And I said that the computational basis for this understanding could be generative models of the physical and psychological world. And as a way to transition to the rest of the talk, I'll remind you that this rather rich hypothesis that I had in mind is that infants apply a task analysis for these stimuli that connects a physical situation and an action to a mind. And in part 1, I presented one way to test this account. That is, I'm going to select a few contrasts to test and controls that I thought were reasonable, and then to say after each one yes or no, and matches the predictions of the model. But for me, this is still not super satisfying. Like it's a start, but it's not connecting more deeply to these models in terms of the generative continuous representations that they offer. And this challenge seems even more pressing to me because since we did this work a couple of years ago, the models have just gotten way more rich and way more cool. So I'll show you that now. So in work led by Tianmin Xu on the psychology side and Kevin Smith on the physics side, we have models of intuitive physics and psychology where the high level principles are the same as I've always said. So an intuitive theory that is formalized as a set of causal laws that stipulate how agents work and how objects work. And these recent models built on these principles, unlike older models, can actually start with the same input that we give infants, that is an animated scene, can de-render that scene into the relevant agents and obstacles and objects and so on and so forth, and then uses domain-specific computations to reason about the physics and the psychology of that scene. And then the model can provide a rating for how expected or unexpected that outcome is. And along with the models, each of these papers generated a set of stimuli, a huge set of stimuli that could be tested against actual infant behavior. So this is cool to me because it gives us a way of testing a model of the infant mind in a really powerful way where babies and the models see the same stimuli. The vision is to pursue a research program like that, that like babies can go from an animated movie to expectations that are about psychology and physics in a much more systematic way than I've discussed. But there are conceptual and methodological challenges to generating the kind of data we need to do this work. So for the rest of the talk is on challenges. So one of these challenges is moving beyond binary comparisons of small samples. And the second challenge is conceptual clarity on exactly what it is that we want to model. So all along I've been stipulating that looking time can correspond to something like a violation or a prediction error over an intuitive theory. Can I say anything else about that? So first, the methodological challenge. So my aspiration is to use infant behavior to test computational models. And for that, we need high throughput behavioral research, like the equivalent of mechanical Turk or prolific for babies. So we can kind of do this, but we can't do this nearly as fast as we would like. So just for people who don't work with infants, a back of the envelope calculation about how much work and how much time it takes to really collect data from one infant participant. You don't need to read all this, but basically it takes a lot of work in the before times, that is before 2020, such that if you want like an N of 30, what you have to do is you have to spend 4 to 5 hours getting the 5 minutes of behavioral data for infants, which amounts to many, many hours of work that's spread out over a couple months. So just to be clear, this would be fine if that's what it really took, right? Like if we're really interested in these questions in this population, we could do this work. But I think we can all agree that it makes high-powered, robust studies of development difficult. So regardless of whether you're a researcher that's interested in replication or longitudinal studies, or someone like me who wants to test computational models, oftentimes this research stream forces us to have to decide between speed and statistical power. But it doesn't have to be this way. So there's a larger field-wide aim to move towards robust cumulative infant research. And there's many tools in our toolkit that we have now to collect more data and to get more out of the data that we have. So there's a couple tools that I won't be talking about, including collaborative multi-lab research and meta and mega analysis of prior data. And the key two things I'll be talking about is combining online data collection with automated video annotation. And these two things address two key bottlenecks in the traditional lab approach that I did my PhD in. So as a lot of developmental psychologists learned during the pandemic, online research is actually possible with infants and young children. So this is one paper led by Aaron Chui that shows that across 4 behavioral studies of infants and young kids, you can replicate the in-lab result with comparable effect size if you run the studies online. So that's cool, it's possible, but how far can you get with just online testing? If you're curious, you should read this paper by Ashley Thomas. So the research question is how we identify so-called thick, intimate family-like relationships. And her hypothesis is that one reliable way to tell is to track who shares saliva with whom. So that's cool, but the main thing I wanted to emphasize is that she tested almost 400 babies and kids in this paper, and they were all tested online. So it really is possible to do a whole research program with just online work. But the thing I wanted to spend the most time on is automated gaze annotation. So suppose that you solve the problem of slow data collection by doing online work, but the numbers that actually go into our analysis are not delivered for free. So you get the videos, but typically it takes the field many, many, many hours then to annotate the videos to generate the actual data. Now, people can be trained to do this very reliably. I spent hundreds of hours doing this during my PhD. But this amazing PhD student, Yotam Errol, built iCatcher, which is a tool to do the same thing automatically. So in the first iteration of this project, they trained and tested the model on one large-scale data set of kids in a word comprehension task that's done in the lab. So I forget if I shared my sound, but basically this child is hearing, do you like the balloon? And the measure is whether and how quickly kids are able to look at the indicated picture after hearing the word. So this is a classic paradigm in studies of language development. And the key results are that they got over 90% frame by frame agreement with human raters for the primary dependent measure of the study, which is preferential looking for the left or to the right, with lower performance for away. And also they replicated the key finding from the original study using this completely automated system. And to be clear, there were 0 hours of human labor that were required to get numbers out of the videos once the network was built and trained. So a few of us saw this and thought this was totally amazing and that we should keep working on it. So with this team of people, I've been helping to coordinate the next round of the work. So the right column is the original eye catcher team. Everyone else is a newer addition. And I wanted to highlight these two grad students on the top left who did a final project for a computer vision class at MIT using eye catcher that really spurred the current findings that I'm about to tell you about. So my dream is for our whole field to have access to reliable automated coding of infant behavior. But what would it take for us to be confident in the tool? Well, I would say that we need accuracy. We need results or annotations that are just as good as human ratings on the dependent measures that my field cares about. It needs to be robust. So not just accurate for some babies or some labs or some paradigms, but robust for everybody. And also usable for developmental labs across the field. So in particular, if you want to combine this with online research, you better show good performance for videos, not just those collected in the labs, like the ones in the top row, but also clips from online research, in this case, videos collected over the Lookit platform. So these are the two data sets for the current work. So for the California data set, we've occluded the faces of the kids to protect participant privacy, but all the families in the Lookit videos have gave consent to publicly share videos. So for today, most of the visualizations are going to focus on the Lookit videos. So now I'll present a high-level overview of the system. So given a frame, a face detector first extracts potential patches containing faces and then feeds them into a classifier that says for each potential face, is it the face of a child? And then if there's more than one child's face, which of these most likely belongs to the participant? Then a stack of 5 consecutive frames are fed along with position and size information into a neural network that then is trained to output a label. So looking away or looking to the left or looking to the right, and a confidence score. So the idea is that we use ground truth labels supplied by humans to train the model. And then we can test the model on held out videos that it's never seen before to investigate the performance that we could expect as a researcher. And today we're going to use the 2 data sets I already showed you to train and test the model in this way. So these data sets we've deliberately selected because they vary in many ways. So things like age range and research topic and setting, consistency versus noise in the video features, and so on. The trick though is because these 2 video data sets vary in so many ways, it's hard to tell if we see a difference in performance, which factors are contributing to that difference. So just wanted to flag that. So now I'm going to show you performance. So we have 4 different evaluation metrics. So we have metrics at the level of individual frames and at the level of individual trials. So we have % agreement and Cohen's kappa over all frames in the video where eye catcher could find a face and humans didn't flag for exclusion because the baby was fussy, for example. And we also have intraclass correlation coefficient for both looking time and percentage looking to the right across all trials in the video. So now I'll show you performance on the held out test set from each data set. So in blue is human-human agreement and orange is human model agreement. So for the California data set, it's looking really, really good. We've pretty much got human performance, especially for the main dependent measure of the study, which is preferential looking. And now the same metrics for Lookit. So notably, we see that human-human agreement is lower on some of these measures. And also model performance is lower, although I'll say it's notably great for duration looking and it's poor for looking to the left and to the right. So again, we might all have hypotheses about what is really driving differences in performance, but it's really hard to tell at this point without more data sets and ideally random assignment of participants to different conditions. So overall, we see high agreement between the human and the model over frames and trials with some room to grow for the Lookit data set. And I just have a few more slides here that's digging a little deeper into performance that I thought I would show you. So on the right, we have 2 plots that are plots for one video in the test set. So we have correspondence between 2 human raters in blue and between a human and a model in yellow. And we have looking time per trial on the top and percentage looking to the right on the bottom. And as you can see, this is a model. This is a video where the model did pretty well in the temporal units that my field cares about, which is at the level of trials. And I'll also show you a frame-by-frame visualization of part of this video where you see a green bounding box around the inferred participant's face. The arrow indicates the looking direction, and you also see a confidence score within the bounding box. So now I'll show you the visualization. So if you're an infant researcher, if you've ever annotated these videos, you should be very happy because this is pretty much the visualization pretty much lines up exactly with a reliable person's intuitions about when the baby is transitioning from looking in one direction versus another. So now I'll tell you briefly about the failure modes. So there's two main ones. The first mode is where eye catcher couldn't even get started because no infant face was found. So here's an example of that. As you might guess, this happens when the infant is covering their own face, or in fact, when they're turned away from the screen, or when they're moving a lot. In fact, a lot of frames like this are cases where the infant is in fact looking away from the screen, so there is no face detected. And in fact, remapping the no face label with away improves model human agreement, suggesting that a lot of the cases where we couldn't find a face is in fact cases where the infant was looking away from the screen. And the second mode is that a face was found, but the model gave the incorrect label. So here's an example of that. So I don't know about you, but I've spent hundreds of hours annotating infant behavior. And even for me, that one is pretty tough because the baby is kind of looking towards the center of the screen. And in fact, when we qualitatively look across all the videos in the test set, these cases happen a lot when the infant's just moving all over the place, or again, when their face is occluded, or when they're looking kind of towards the center of the screen. So for developmental psychologists, they might think this is very cool, but what about my data set that I've collected that I want to annotate, but the network has never seen before? So here are results of a test like that. So here we have a completely separate data set that's collected over Zoom, where the primary dependent measure was looking duration per trial. And we basically passed these videos through the model that was trained on look at videos. So there's no further retraining. And overall, we see very good trial by trial agreement on the dependent measure of this study, which is duration looking per trial. And that's not only true in general, but if you look at every single individual video. So in summary, things are looking good. Okay, there's a lot more in this preprint that we just posted, so you can have a look. But for me, this means that we're pretty close to meeting the accuracy and the robustness criteria that we started out with. And now part of the work is really making the tool usable for researchers in my field. So the dream would be if we were able to trim down the model to make inference faster. You could imagine integrating this with online platforms like Lookit that would enable fully automated participant contingent looking time experiments that right now are not possible to run online. Okay, so in part 2, I talked about what I'm doing to work through this first challenge, which is that simply we cannot collect enough data fast enough to do the kind of high throughput behavioral research that we need to do to test these models at scale. And I said that online data collection and automated gaze annotation addresses this problem. Doesn't only do that, but it also enables many other research programs. And the second challenge that I'll talk about is a conceptual challenge. So I say, I plan to model longer looking from violation of expectation studies as prediction error over these models of the world. But can I say anything more about that? Why do I think that is the right way to think about looking time in these experiments? So many studies in my field report longer looking to events that adults say are unexpected. And almost all the experiments are run in this particular structure that I'll cover right now. So during these studies, infants are first familiarized or habituated to a stimulus, like those on the top row, and then shown 2 possible outcomes that follow. One that, let's say, adults would say is expected, and one that adults would say is unexpected. And I'll show you all the videos from this next experiment now, but in brief, the first column is a violation of action efficiency. So the agent is jumping higher than it needs to, and that's basically the experiment that we started the talk with. The second column is a violation of goal-directed behavior. So this is the agent failing to follow the goal that's changed location. The third column is a violation of solidity, where this rotating fan moves through the red block. And the fourth column is a violation of object support, where the ball rolls off of the edge of the platform and hovers in midair. And note that there are actually built-in controls for perceptual alternatives in these stimuli. So we've already talked about for the constraints task, this task, for example, the unexpected outcome follows the same path and the expected follows a new path. So people have done a reasonable job in these conditions and also other control conditions to rule out perceptual explanations for longer looking. But in spite of our best efforts, it's often still unclear. So many studies report longer looking when agents behave inefficiently or change their goals, or when objects appear to pass through each other or float in midair. But the question is why, right? So I've been saying part of what drives longer looking is that these surprising events violate infants' domain-specific intuitive theories of how agents and objects work. But it's possible that infants look longer to these stimuli in virtue of distinct perceptual features that behavioral researchers just haven't accounted for yet, because our time is limited and we can't run an infinite number of control conditions. And the third possible driver is that longer looking doesn't only reflect the detection of a prediction error, but also exploration of why. So infants might look longer, not only because they've noticed that something is weird, but also to explore and to learn more about the source of surprise. So there are lots of papers in the literature that's trying to hash this out. This is not a solved problem. So depending on who you ask, either we're able to handle it with good experimental design, or this problem is so devastating that we shouldn't use violation of expectation as a method at all anymore. So now comes cognitive neuroscience. These reasons for looking are often hard to tease apart with behavior, but possible with the tools of cognitive neuroscience. So we know a lot about the regions that support psychological and physical reasoning, perceptual processing, and task-driven attention and learning. So in this project, we hypothesized that each of these non-mutually exclusive explanations for longer looking has a corresponding set of distinct, though not mutually exclusive, neural correlates, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna scan adult participants while they watch these classic movies from developmental psychology that are organized into little violation of expectation experiments. And then we're gonna look at each set of regions that's associated with each hypothesized mechanism of longer looking. And then we're gonna measure the responses of those regions to these videos. So now I'll show you the results one hypothesis at a time. So the first hypothesis that I talked about is that surprising events elicit longer looking because they entail a violation of an intuitive theory. So how are we going to test this hypothesis? Well, we're going to take a functional regions of interest approach. So basically, using one partition of the data, we're going to find for each participant a set of voxels that, in this case, responds more to physical than psychological movies. And then in independent data, we're going to ask, okay, so for the voxels that plausibly represent distinctively physical aspects of the stimuli, do those voxels show evidence for domain-specific prediction error? If so, we should expect greater activity in those held out data for unexpected physical events than expected physical events, but only in the domain of physics and not for psychology. Okay, so what did we find? So I have activity extracted from the independent data on the y-axis, and we have responses to the physics videos in blue and responses to the psychology videos in red, and responses to unexpected videos in darker colors, and responses to expected videos in lighter colors. So in bilateral supramarginal gyrus, which is a key part of a network of regions that in prior work has been shown to represent physical information and engage in physical reasoning, those same voxels that represent physical information in general also represents prediction error over that information. So we do see positive evidence for domain-specific physical prediction error. Next, we're going to apply this logic to psychology. So now for each person, we're going to say, given the voxels that prefer psychological events, return the responses of those voxels to all 4 conditions in independent data. So one of these regions was STS, which in prior work seems to be engaged in social reasoning above other tasks. And in these regions, we definitely see a bigger response for the psychology events over the physical events in general, but we don't see a difference in the response to the expected versus unexpected contrast in a way that's different across the 2 domains. So for me, this means that there's so far no evidence for domain-specific prediction error for intuitive psychology. Now notice that all along, I've been making an argument that we need physical understanding in order to make sense of these psychological events. And one implication of this finding could be that, well, maybe the reason we don't see as strong domain-specific psychological responses in general, or novelty responses in particular, and the reason for that is that we need physical understanding in order to make sense of these psychological events. So do we see any evidence for that in the data? And it's particularly interesting to look at the constraints task, which is the task that we've been talking about for the entire talk, that I think is a distinctively physical task, more so than this other task, which is just about predicting whether an agent is moving to the left or the right. So if that's right, then even though this is technically a psychological task that we've classified as a psychological task, then it still requires like distinctively physical reasoning. It requires computations that are from intuitive physics. So just to put it really plainly, what does it take to expect action efficiency? You might have to represent that the agent is solid and can't pass through the barrier. You might have to understand that the action is costly, that is, the agent can't resist support without effort, and that what the agent is doing is to minimizing the force applied over the path to pursue that goal. So far I showed you the results collapsed across these tasks within domains, but actually if you look at one of the physics regions of interest for each of the 4 tasks separately, we found that not only does that region respond to violations of solidity and support, but also to violations of action efficiency and not to violations of goal-directed action. And to me, that's a hint that these neural regions that support distinctively physical and psychological understanding are working together to make sense of these scenes. So that's a sidebar. Now we're going to go back to the hypotheses. So we talked about hypothesis 1, which is infants look longer at these events by virtue of surprising events involving a violation of an intuitive theory. But now we're going to talk about hypothesis 2, which is that surprising events in these stimuli also have distinctive perceptual features. So here, we're going to extract the voxels that respond to the first movie within a little block, regardless of what it is. So this contrast embodies actually a lot of changes, anything from like low-level luminance and motion to higher-level categories of objects. And we found 2 parcels given the group data, one in bilateral lateral occipital gyrus and the other in ventral temporal cortex. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so in these voxels that respond to new visual information in general, do they also respond more to unexpected events from both domains? So what we found is that the answer is yes. That is, these regions that respond to new visual information also respond more to unexpected psychological and physical events, and that provides evidence for this perceptual novelty hypothesis. But I think one key open question is exactly what perceptual information this is reflecting or picking up on. So note that in this first attempt, we didn't habituate adults to these plausible perceptual features like, a longer path, faster jumping, and so on, before the test events, which we do when we study infants. And also note that this activity could either result from a bottom-up response to distinctive features that are in novel events, or also prediction error passed down from in a top-down manner from the other ROI. So it's really unclear at this point what the nature of this finding is. And the third hypothesis is endogenous curiosity. So here we applied an anatomical constraint from prior work, and we basically said, okay, in regions that in prior research appear to drive endogenous attention and represent the reward of information, do those regions respond more to unexpected than expected events? And what we found is positive, though weaker evidence in some of the ROIs, although note that we probably could do a better job of localizing this construct in the next attempt, and we're planning on doing that. So what do we conclude? Returning to the three hypotheses, I think we have clear evidence for domain-specific physical prediction error and perceptual novelty, and weaker evidence, though still positive evidence for the endogenous curiosity hypothesis. But I actually think like one broad takeaway is that we can actually study these different dimensions of novelty in these stimuli using neuroimaging. Now, to be clear, these are the brains of adults, right? So this doesn't tell us which of these actually drives longer looking in infants, and it's probably going to take us a while to figure out how to do that. But while we figure that out, we've also devised some ways of studying this with just behavioral work. So we said that these questions are hard to study with behavior, but it's not impossible. So I'll present one awesome case study that this undergraduate student in the lab, Lynette Cuna, has been working on. So the critical thing to understand here is that all along I've been saying, well, perceptual novelty is this thing that is lurking in the background of all of our studies. But a question is that really true? So I've said, given displays like this, each of these test events has a source of novelty. This is novel because it's inefficient, and this is novel because it's a new path. So both events are novel in some way, and both could plausibly drive longer looking. So is that true if you actually look at the empirical data? So if you actually look at the 87 babies we've tested on this stimulus set, there's not evidence that this contrast that is between the last habituation event and the first efficient event that entails a change in the path, there's just no evidence right now that that change in path is driving longer looking in babies. So this is just one data set, but if this holds up across data sets, I think the implication is that the stimuli that we have that are intended to evoke representations of agents and objects and actions that are abstracting away from lower level stimulus features, that attempt might actually just be way more successful than even we expected. Like this finding completely surprised me. And I think in the context of the talk, the implication is even if perceptual novelty is present in the stimulus and represented in the brain, it doesn't necessarily mean that it drives behavior. So just to summarize, this work shows it's possible to break down these stimuli into three different types of task analyses that are centered on perceptual information, domain-specific information, and general curiosity. And I think the main takeaway is just that like we can actually make progress on this question. And right now we're not yet linking, neural and behavioral data in infants. That's kind of the ultimate goal. And I look forward to doing that kind of work. So eventually we want to know, to the extent that infants also represent these dimensions of novelty in the stimulus, which of those dimensions drive their behavior under what circumstances? So just to wrap up, today I presented a hypothesis that early in infancy, we start to analyze the actions of other people in terms of intuitive theories of psychology that are grounded in physics. And I've showed you progress so far on testing the hypothesis, first on just a few key binary contrasts using infant looking time. But then I said, if I want to move beyond these binary qualitative contrasts, I need a means of acquiring data more quickly. So I presented EyeCatcher, a way for us to do that and to actually test these models at scale. And then in the third part of the talk, I said, I need to sort out what longer looking in these studies actually reflects. And I talked about ways of dealing with this conceptual challenge using the tools of cognitive neuroscience. And it turns out that this just provides us with a nice, compelling way to study different drivers of longer looking to be tested further in future work. So just returning to the big picture, I'm going to be starting a lab at Johns Hopkins next year. And I hope that with these tools in hand, We have the potential to enable high-powered and conceptually precise studies about the organs of the mind in the domains that are dearest to my heart, which is intuitive psychology. And if you know any students or postdocs who want to work in this space, just tell them to shoot me an email. And I'll just end by saying that classically, both the fields that I've worked in so far in my career, so cognitive neuroscience and developmental psychology, both of these fields tend to study intuitive physics and intuitive psychology in isolation, in contrast to each other, oftentimes literally by subtracting one out from the other in contrast. But if what I'm hypothesizing is true, then this means that actually social intelligence is impossible without physical intelligence. And we need to put these two domains back together in order to understand other people's minds and actions. Okay, so that's the end. I ran a little over time, sorry about that. I'll just acknowledge collaborators, funders, and all of you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to post in the Q&A, I can read them out. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 questions before the trainee Q&A session, which I'm sending the link for right now. And maybe just to get the ball rolling, I can start with a question that I had, which relates to the eye catcher model. And I was wondering if you've tried any or compared this model to something like Deep Lab Cut that does automated behavioral tracking of different types of animal behaviors. I've worked with that a little bit and was thinking that that could be a really useful tool for actually tracking eye movements.
Yeah, this is a great question. So just to give a little bit of historical context, prior to the publication of the 2022 paper on the first iteration, depending on who you talk to, if you talk to computer vision people, they say this is a trivial problem. It's already solved. Like, why do you want me to work on this? And if you ask developmental psychologists, they say it's not solved. And also not a lot of us have the technical skills we need in order to make progress. So then basically we were at a standstill for a long time. And I think the first round taught us that if you want to use this tool to classify infant behavior, the tools that are currently available to do the same things for adults just won't work very well. So part of it is obvious things like, infant faces look different from adult faces. You can't tell them to hold relatively still. They're just going to do whatever they want. And part of it is just empirically, if you actually train those models on the same videos. I think they tried RT-Gene. I don't think they tried the tool that you're talking about, but they did comparisons of iCatcher, vanilla iCatcher, the original, to a couple of other things, and they showed either that iCatcher is better or does about the same, but in a much more computationally efficient way, which would enable kind of on the fly, given a webcam feed, classification in a way that other tools wouldn't be able to do. So I certainly think like there are tools that could do this thing, but it really does take people from computer vision and people from developmental psychology to work together, and also to get the data sets to do the training. So the thing that was hardest about working on this next iteration, honestly, was getting the data and organizing it and actually fixing issues generated by humans in the annotation files, believe it or not. So I think that there are other tools that could plausibly do the job just as well, but it takes that configuration of people plus the data in order to actually assess it.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to read out a question from Cameron Ellis, who says, really great talk. Is there reason to believe that the mechanisms driving looking time will be consistent across different tasks, or will it be task dependent?
I really doubt it's going to be, I doubt there's going to be a universal set of linking functions that connects task features to looking time, even the same features. Like one thing that we've been talking about in our lab is that it seems like when babies go into an experiment that's like about perceptual processing or about word learning or whatever, they seem to kind of know what experiment they're in, and they tend to be able to focus on the features that are relevant. So for example, in my studies, I have a piece of evidence that they don't really care about the change in the path at all. That seems to be less relevant. But in other studies, these methods were originally developed to study vision and hearing. So definitely in other studies, these perceptual drivers are the things that are driving infant looking. So I think part of the challenge is to work out how babies know which experiment they're in, and also is there any kind of way of systematically being able to predict out of sample, in this study, these are the features that are going to matter with these weights. So I think the answer is going to turn out to be different things matter for longer looking in different experiments, and it remains to be seen whether there is a way of systematically making predictions about which ones matter when.
Great, and maybe we'll take one last question from Jeremy Stride, sorry if I mispronounced that. This is so neat. In addition to making predictions based on what they have learned about intuitive physics, do infants know what they don't know? And does this drive intrinsically motivated exploration? For example, pushing objects off tables and seeing what would break them.
Yeah, so there's one traditional view of the infant mind, which is that infants are passive incidental learners, that they're kind of just like opening their eyes and the input just comes, and this is the thing that is really driving their development and learning. And there's another view that says, no, they're active. From birth, they're selecting the information and the input that they get. And they're trying to tailor their behavior to maximize learning. So this isn't my work, but there is work from Lisa Feigenson's lab that shows that after seeing a violation of solidity versus support, infants appear to be motivated to learn about the source of the surprise through their behavior. So there's one study where infants see an object pass through a wall or hover in midair, and then they're given the objects. And I think the finding is that after seeing a violation of support, they're more likely to drop the objects than bang them, and vice versa if they saw a violation of object solidity. So now that's just one study, but that is one piece of evidence that, if true, this really means that when infants look longer, this is an exploratory behavior that could lead to tailored exploration that's intrinsically motivated in exactly the way that you're talking about.
All right, well, thank you so much. Maybe we'll take like a 10-minute break before resuming the Q&A.
Great, that sounds great.
Dr. Liu some time, but I'll open up that Zoom room now for anybody who does want to join. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much.